beloved wanderers. You just found Shalom Bible ASMR, a sanctuary of slow, sacred stories. Tonight, we journey together through the 40 years in the wilderness, day by day asterisk, a 10-part sleep series where every whisper carries you deeper into the desert. Feel the weight of the Israelites' sandals. Taste the manna and let the murmurs of ancient crowds lull you into peace. This 2-hour saga is divided into 12-minute chapters, each a meticulous meditation on patience. From the dust of Exodus to Moses' final breath, perfect for sleep, study, or soulful reflection. If you crave restful scripture, subscribe and click the bell so you never miss a chapter. Let's begin. Chapter 1. The dust of the departure. Dawn had barely begun to tint the horizon a pale blue when the first stirrings were felt in camp. The night stars, which had silently witnessed the Israelites' weary sleep, were going out one by one, like lamps being carefully extinguished. The cool early morning air enveloped the goatskin tents, causing some sleepers to huddle deeper into their rough blankets before the sun warmed them too much. In the largest tent, Moses was already awake, his eyes marked by countless nights of vigil. Studied the mental map of his people. He could hear the first sounds of the awakening camp. The scraping of sandals against the sand, the clinking of cooking utensils, the whisper of women beginning their daily tasks. With callous hands, he took his walking stick, the same one that had seen miracles, and stepped out into the fresh dawn air. The camp stretched out before him like a disordered sea of furs and cloth. Here and there, thin plumes of smoke rose in the fires being rekindled for breakfast. The children, always the first awake, were already scampering among the tents, playing hide and seek among the sacks of provisions or chasing the smallest goats. "Hey, don't run with that jug," a mother's gruff voice echoed in the still air. A girl no more than 7 years old stopped in her tracks, adjusting the heavy water container in her tiny arms. Further away, a group of elders gathered in a circle, sharing a skin of fresh water they had stored overnight. Their deep voices formed a constant murmur that mingled with other sounds in the camp. The rhythmic blow of a hammer against a stake, the crackle of burning firewood, the plaintive bleat of sheep protesting at being milked too early. At the eastern edge of the camp, the shepherds were already on the move. Long staffs in hand, they guided the flocks toward the few thickets where they could graze before the day's heat withered them completely. The sheep, their feet covered in the dust of the previous day, moved in a slow procession, leaving behind a trail of small footprints that would soon be erased by the wind. "Watch out for that billy goat," a young shepherd warned his companion. Yesterday he almost knocked Leah down when she tried to carry him away. Meanwhile, in the center of the camp, the women worked at the morning chores. A group ground grain between large stones, their movements rhythmic and synchronized by years of practice. Others prepared the unleavened bread, kneading the flour with little water and cooking it quickly on hot stones. The smell of freshly baked bread began to mix with the aroma of wild herbs that some gathered to season their simple meals. "Have you seen my bone needle?" a young woman asked her neighbor as she checked her small sewing kit. "I needed to mend my son's tunic." "I think you left it near the well yesterday afternoon," the other replied without looking up from her task of weaving a new basket with dried reeds. The sun was now rising decisively, its rays beginning to warm the sand beneath the children's bare feet. In the tent of meeting, Aaron was already supervising the Levites in their preparations of the day. The sacred objects had to be carefully wrapped in their special cloths before the march began. Each piece had its exact place, its specific preparation ritual. "Remember," Aaron warned as he adjusted his ephod, "the ark must always be carried to the center of the column, protected from the front and the back." As the heat increased, the pace of the camp became more urgent. Tents were officially taken down, their skins and poles carefully rolled and tied to be loaded onto the backs of donkeys. Younger children were placed in baskets that would sway rhythmically with the animals' every step. The elders gathered in small groups, quietly discussing the rumors circulating about the journey ahead. "I hear there's an oasis beyond those hills," one commented, pointing toward the western horizon. "I hear there are hostile tribes," another replied, adjusting the cloth that shielded his head from the sun. Moses, watching all this from a small rise, took a deep breath. The weight of his leadership felt heavier than ever on these mornings of departure. Every face he saw, every elder, every mother, every child, was a responsibility he carried on his shoulders. "It's time," he murmured to himself, and with a firm gesture, he raised his staff. The sound of the shofar echoed in the dry air, its call clear and penetrating. As if they were a single organism, the camp began to move. The shepherds called their flocks, the mothers counted their children, the men took up their burdens. Step by step, the enormous column began to advance toward the indistinct horizon. The dust rose thousands of feet below, forming a golden cloud that marked their passage. Voices mingled, instructions, greetings, pleas, creating a constant murmur that would accompany their march throughout the day. Behind them, only the empty circle where the camp had been remained, the march of the tents already being erased by the soft desert wind. Ahead, only the uncertainty of a path none of them had traveled before. And so, under the indifferent gaze of the desert sun, the exodus continued, step by step, day by day, toward a promise that some were beginning to doubt existed. But they kept walking, because deep down, what other choice did they have? The midday heat fell like a heavy blanket over the travelers. The conversations became more spaced out, the children's laughter less frequent. Only the constant crunch of sand underfoot and the occasional bleat of sheep broke the silence. Somewhere along the endless column, a woman began to sing softly. It was an ancient song, one her grandmothers had sung by the Nile. Gradually, other voices joined in, creating a sad yet hopeful melody that floated over the dust of the road. Moses, walking in front, heard the singing and smiled slightly. As long as they had songs, he thought, perhaps they also had hope. And with that fragile certainty in his heart, he adjusted his grip on the staff and continued walking toward a horizon that never seemed to draw nearer. Chapter 2. The Sand Complaint, years 5 to 8. The sun rose, as it always did, with a sluggish inevitability that seemed to mock their exhaustion, its pale light seeping across the encampment like spilled oil, slow and thick, revealing in gradual stages a familiar tableau of their existence. The water carriers, backs permanently bent from years of hauling skins that never seemed to hold enough, moving in their daily pilgrimage to cisterns where the water level sank lower with each passing moon, their sandals scuffing against stones, worn smooth by generations of feet that trod this path before them, while the bakers, their hands cracked and calloused from endless kneading, worked the manna into the same flat, tasteless discs they'd made every morning since the first miraculous fall from heaven. The dough clinging to their fingers with stubborn persistence that no amount of wiping could fully erase, leaving behind a gritty film that would linger until the next washing. And the children, those born under the shadow of Sinai who knew no other life, played their repetitive games with the same handful of bleached pebbles, arranging them in patterns that might have been houses or animals or the fabled cities of Egypt that existed now only in the half-remembered stories of their elders, while their mothers watched with eyes that had long since lost their luster, their faces lined with the deep grooves of resignation, because what else was there to do but rise with the sun and perform the rituals of survival, and wait for the day to pass, and sleep, and wake to do it all again. The murmurs of discontent began before the first meal was even distributed, whispering the same tired tones about the same unchangeable facts. The manna, always the manna, which today carried the faint metallic tang of the morning dew, or perhaps the ghost of yesterday's bitterness, or perhaps nothing at all beyond the dull, chewy nothingness that had sustained them for years, but which would be consumed regardless because the alternative was starvation and the heat, no more oppressive than yesterday, but somehow heavier in their bones, pressing down with the weight of 1,000 unseen hands, and the thirst, sharper today because the nearest spring had turned salty overnight, and the sand, always the sand, working its way into every fold of fabric, every crease of skin, every seam of their meager possessions, until even their dreams were tinged with grit and the crushing sameness of their existence. The way each dawn brought only minor variations on a theme they had all long since memorized, a birth that echoed the dozens before it, a death that followed the same rituals as the last, a prophecy that sounded suspiciously like one uttered 3 moons prior, until even the most extraordinary events felt like footnotes in an endlessly repeating scroll. The rebellion, when it finally coalesced in the miasma of discontent, was almost a welcome distraction, a break in the numbing routine, though it began as most things did in the camp, with quiet conversations held in shadow corners, with meaningful glances exchanged during evening distributions, with Korah and his followers speaking in measured tones about fairness and shared burdens and the arrogance of Moses' leadership. Their words new, but the sentiment as old as hunger itself, as inevitable as the creeping advance of the dunes that surrounded them. The day the earth split open at dawn like any other. The same relentless sun, the same dry wind carrying the same dust, the same rituals performed with the same weary precision, until the ground itself seemed to sigh before tearing apart with sound like the rending of the temple veil, a yawning chasm swallowing men, tents, and possessions alike before sealing itself with finality that left no room for argument. And the silence that followed was not the silence of reverence, but the heavy quiet of a people too drained to muster surprise, too worn by years of wandering to do anything but return to their tasks, because the manna still needed gathering before the sun grew too hot, the water still needed rationing lest it run out before the next oasis, the sand still needed sweeping from tent flaps and cooking pots, and tomorrow would come regardless, bringing with the same needs, the same chores, the same unyielding horizon, stretching onward into a future that seemed as unchanging as the endless sky above them. The afternoons were the worst, when the sun hung suspended at its zenith, a white-hot coin burning away all thought beyond the need for shade and water. The camp reduced a collection of slumped figures huddled under whatever scraps of fabric could be stretched between poles, the air so thick with heat that breathing became a conscious effort, each inhalation carrying the taste of dust and despair, while the children, listless with exhaustion, ceased even their half-hearted games and lay like discarded dolls in whatever patches of shadow they could find, their skin gritty with sand that no amount of brushing could dislodge, their eyes dulled in knowledge that this was all they would ever know, an endless cycle of heat and hunger and thirst, broken only by the occasional moment of terror or wonder that faded quickly into the grinding routine of survival. The elders spoke less now, their voices worn thin by years of telling the same stories, their memories of Egypt fading like ink on sun-bleached parchment, until even the plagues and the parting of the sea seemed like tales told about another people in another time, their power diminished by repetition, their lessons lost on ears that heard them too many times to find meaning in them anymore. The younger ones, those who had no memory of brick-making or Pharaoh's court, watched their parents with mixture of pity and resentment, unable to understand the weight of what had been left behind, yet chafing against the limits of what had been given in its place. This barren wasteland, this unending journey, this God who spoke in fire and smoke, but left them to choke on dust. Even the rebellions had taken on ritualistic quality, the same arguments rising at regular intervals like the phases of the moon, the same grievances air with minor variations, the same inevitable outcomes, some dramatic display of divine power, followed by a period of fearful obedience that gradually eroded back into murmuring, the cycle completing itself again and again like the turning of the seasons in a land that had no seasons. And through it all, the sand remained, creeping into every aspect of their lives with patience that bordered on malevolence, sifting into their food no matter how carefully it was covered, working its way into the fibers of their clothing until even the softest fabric became abrasive, finding its way into their sleeping mats, so that every night was spent on a bed of grit, the tiny grains grinding against skin already raw from sun and wind, a constant, itching reminder of the wilderness's dominion over them. They shook it from their hair each morning only to find it replaced by noon, brushed it from their shoulders only to feel it settling back moments later, until even the most fastidious among them gave up the fight and accepted its presence as one more unchangeable fact of their existence. The sand was in their mouths when they spoke, in their ears when they listened, in their eyes when they wept. If they still had tears left to shed after so many years beneath the merciless sky, it coated their tongues when they ate, lending even the freshest manna a gritty texture that no amount of chewing could soften, and when they drank, it settled at the bottom of their cups, a fine sediment that was a last thing to pass their lips with each sip. It infiltrated their tools, dulling knife blades and clogging the mechanisms of their few precious pieces of technology brought from Egypt, until even most skilled craftsmen could do little more than perform rudimentary repairs on materials that degraded a little more each day. The sand was in their scrolls too, abrading the delicate parchment, forcing the scribes to work with extra care lest their words be lost to creeping erosion, their records of laws and lineages and complaints growing thinner as the surfaces wore away, the history of their people slowly being ground into nothingness by the same force that was wearing down their bodies and their spirits. And yet life persisted. Babies were born, their first cries swallowed by the vast silence of the wilderness, their tiny fingers already curling around the grit that would accompany them all their days. The sick were tended, though medicines were scarce and knowledge scarcer still. The healers relying on half-remembered remedies from a land most of them would never see again. The dead were buried, wrapped in whatever cloth could be spared, their graves marked with stones that would soon be obscured by the shifting dunes, their names spoken less and less with each passing year until they existed only as faint impressions in the collective memory, as insubstantial as the footprints they left behind in the sand. The people moved through their days with mechanical determination, performing the necessary tasks with hands that remembered the motions even when their minds had long since disengaged, their thoughts turning inward to private landscapes of memory and longing where the sand could not reach. They celebrated the festivals commanded by Moses, though the joy was forced and the meaning blurred by time and distance. The rituals performed out of habit rather than understanding, the words of the prayers growing hollow with repetition. They listened to the laws as they were read, though the finer points escaped them, the nuances lost in the sheer volume of regulations that govern every aspect of their existence, for what they could eat to how they could cleanse themselves when the inevitable impurities of life in the wilderness befell them. They brought their offerings of the tabernacle, though the animals grew leaner each year and the grain more scarce, the priests accepting what was given with the same solemn expressions, the smoke from the altar rising in thin columns that dissipated quickly in the dry air, as though even their worship was being swallowed by the endless hunger of the desert. And always there was the walking, the slow, plodding advance from one campsite to next, the columns stretching for miles across the barren landscape, feet dragging through sand that gave way beneath them. Their progress measured not in distance covered, but in blisters formed and sandals worn through, the landmarks blurring together until one stretch of wasteland was indistinguishable from the next. They walked when the sun was high and the heat threatened to cook them in their own skins, and they walked when the cold of night made their bones ache and their breath fall before their faces. They walked when they were hungry and when they were tired and when they were sick at heart, because stopping was not an option, because the cloud moved and they must follow, because this was their life now, an endless procession toward a destination that never seemed to grow any closer. Their existence reduced to the rhythm of their footsteps and the sound they're breathing, and the ever-present whisper of sand against sand, the only constants in a world that had stripped away everything else. The children who'd been small when they left Egypt were grown now, with children of their own who knew nothing of the world beyond the tents and the walking, their horizons limited by the next rise of land, their futures as uncertain as the path that lay ahead. The elders grew more bent with each passing year, their steps slower, their eyesight dimmer, until one morning they would not wake, and their bodies would be left behind in the wilderness, another marker on a road that led only onward, ever onward, through the sand of complaint and the years of wandering. Toward a promise it seemed some days like just one more mirage shimmering on the distant horizon. Chapter 3. The Way to the Tablets, years 9 to 12. The sun had not yet crested the jagged peaks of Sinai when Moses began his ascent, his sandals scraping against the ancient stone, each step measured and deliberate, as if the mountain itself resisted his progress, the path winding upward through veils of morning mist that clung to rocks like ghostly shawls, the air thin and brittle, carrying the distant murmur of the camp below, already stirred with the day's routines, the clatter of pots, the bleating of goats, the drowsy voices of children, sounds that grew fainter with every step he took, swallowed by the vast, echoing silence of mountain, until there was only the rhythm of his breath, the steady pulse of his heart, and the weight of expectation pressing down upon his shoulders, heavier than the pack he carried, heavier even in the years of leadership that had etched their lines deep into his face. For day he would meet not the burning bush of his youth, not the fleeting glimpses of glory that had guided them thus far, but the full, terrible presence of the God who had brought them out of Egypt, the God who had split the sea and rained bread from heaven, the God whose voice had thundered from this very mountain, shaking the earth to its foundations, leaving the people trembling at its base, their faces pressed to ground, begging Moses to stand between them and the divine fire. And so he climbed, his staff striking the stone with sharp, lonely crack that echoed off the cliffs, the sound marking time like the beat of a drum, each strike a reminder of the distance growing between him and the people below, between the man he had been and the prophet he was becoming, the rock beneath his feet rough and unyielding, its surface scored by centuries of wind and rain, yet somehow alive, hung with energy that vibrated up through his bones, as if the mountain were a living thing, watching, waiting, and as he climbed higher, the mist thickened, coiling around him like smoke, obscuring the path until he moved through a world of shifting gray, the boundaries between earth and sky dissolving, leaving him untethered, suspended between realms, his only guide the occasional glint of sunlight on wet stone, the occasional scuff of his sandal against rock, until at last the mist parted, and he stood on a narrow ledge, the wind howling around him, tearing his robes, and before him rose the summit, wreathed in cloud, its peak hidden, its slopes strewn with loose shale that clattered away beneath his feet, the sound swallowed by the yawning emptiness below. And for a moment he hesitated, his breath coming fast, his hands trembling, not from exhaustion, though his muscles burned, not from fear, though the height was dizzying, but from a knowledge that beyond that veil of cloud lay something beyond human understanding, something that would demand everything he had to give, and then more, and still he climbed, his fingers scrabbling for purchase, his knees scraping against stone, the air growing thinner, colder, until at last he pulled himself over the final ledge and onto the summit, where the world fell away on all sides, leaving him exposed, utterly alone, and there in that barren, wind-scoured place he waited, the silence so complete it rang in his ears, the stillness so absolute he could hear the blood rushing his veins, and then a sound not from the mountain, not from the sky, but from everywhere at once, a sound like the roar of 1,000 waters, like the crash of 1,000 storms, and the rock beneath him shuddered, and the air ignited, and the presence of God descended like a fire that did not consume, a light that did not blind but revealed, stripping away every pretense, every doubt, leaving him bare before the glory that spoke his name, not in words, but in the language of creation itself. And in that moment, he understood the weight he carried, not just the stone tablets he would soon bear, but the weight of a people's hope, of a covenant written not in ink, but in blood and promise. And as the voice of God shake commandments into chaos, carving law into fabric reality, Moses knelt, his forehead pressing the stone, his arms outstretched, his whole body trembling with the effort of holding space between the divine and the mortal. And when at last the voice fell silent and the fire faded and the mountain stilled, he rose, his limbs heavy, his eyes burning, and looked down at the tablets in his hands, smooth, unblemished, their surface alive with the fingerprints of God, and knew that the descent would be harder than the climb, for now he carried not just a law, but the knowledge of what would cost to uphold it, the lives it would demand, the rebellions it would spark. And as he turned to face the path downward, the first rays of dawn breaking over the horizon, painting the rocks in gold and crimson, he saw the camp far below, tiny as a child's toy, the smoke of morning fires rising in thin, straight lines, and he knew that nothing would ever be the same. Not for him, not for them, for the weight of those tablets would shape their days, their years, their very souls, long after the stone had crumbled to dust. Below, the people waited, unaware that the ground beneath their feet had shifted, that the rules of their world had been rewritten, their complaint and quarrels continuing as they have for years, as they would for years to come. The women grinding grain, the men mending tents, the children playing the dirt, while high above, unseen, Moses began his slow descent, the tablets cradled against his chest, their weight already settling into his bones, a weight he would carry until the day he laid it down for good. Chapter 4, The Whisper of Serpents, years 13 to 16. The sun had become a merciless tyrant that summer, its golden face leering down upon the Israelite camp with cruel indifference, baking the cracked earth until split into jagged wounds, each fissure exhaling waves of heat that distorted the horizon and turned the distant mountains into liquid hallucinations that danced mockingly at the edge of vision. The air itself had grown thick and heavy, a visible miasma that clung to skin and filled lungs with every labor breath, carrying with it the scent of parched wool, of souring manna left too long in the sun, of the lingering metallic tang of desperation that seemed to seep from the very pores of the people as they moved through their daily routines with the sluggish determination of those who had endured too much for too long. Children, normally resilient in their play, lay listless in whatever patches of shade they could find, their games reduced to half-hearted tracing of patterns in the dust with sun-browned fingers, while their mothers moved between tents with water skins that never seemed full enough, their faces lined with exhaustion and something deeper, a slow-burning resentment that had taken root during the long years of wandering, and now threatened to blossom into full rebellion. The men gathered in sullen clusters at the edges of the camp, their voices low and dangerous as they sharpened tools that needed no sharpening, repaired sandals that would only wear through again, their hands busy, but their minds circling the same unspoken questions like vultures over carrion. Was this their reward for following Moses out of Egypt? To bake alive in this God-forsaken wasteland while their children forgot the taste of grapes and their parents' bones turned to dust beneath the endless sand? The murmurs began as they always did, in the pre-dawn hours when the heat was least oppressive, whisper between women drawing water from the dwindling well, their voices barely audible over the creak of ropes and the splash of water into clay jars. There is no bread, they said, though the manna still appeared with each morning's dew. There is no water, they complained, though their skins were full. The words were familiar, worn smooth by years of repetition, but this time there was a new edge to them, a bitterness that fermented in the long silence of their suffering. By midday, when the sun stood directly overhead like an accusing eye, the whispers had spread to the camp like poison through a bloodstream, carried on parched lips from tent to tent, until even the children had taken up the chant, their high voices piping the words they barely understood, but felt in their empty bellies and sunburned skin. Why have you brought us up out of Egypt to die in this wilderness? For there's no food and no water, and our sole loaves is worthless bread. Moses heard the words as he moved through the camp, his staff striking the hard earth with each measured step, the sound swallowed by the growing tide of discontent. He had heard such complaints before, had weathered them through years of leading the stubborn, stiff-necked people. But today the words settled in his gut like stones, their weight dragging at him with each step. He could see in their eyes as he passed, not just anger, not just frustration, but something worse, contempt. The respect they had once held for him, the awe that kept them in check during the early years of their journey, had eroded like the banks of a flash-flooded wadi, leaving behind only the bare bones resentment. Even the elders, those who stood with him against Pharaoh and witnessed the mighty hand of God at the Red Sea, now looked at him with weary disappointment, as if he alone were responsible for the prolonged exile in this harsh land. He had just opened his mouth to speak, to remind them once more of God's providence, of the miracles they had witnessed with their own eyes, when the earth itself seemed to shudder beneath his feet. Not the dramatic quaking that had accompanied God's descent upon Sinai, but something subtler, more sinister, a vibration that traveled up to the soles of his sandals and into his bones, setting his teeth on edge. Then came the sound, a dry rustling like wind through dead reeds, but lower, wetter, as if the ground itself were breathing. The hairs on the back of Moses' neck stood erect even before the first scream tore through the camp. They came from everywhere at once, from beneath rocks, from the shadows of tents, from the very folds of the people's garments. Serpents unlike any the Israelites had encountered before. Their scales gleamed like polished bronze in the harsh sunlight, catching the light and throwing it back in dazzling, hypnotic patterns. But their eyes were flat and black, absorbing all light and giving none back. They moved with unnatural speed, their bodies flowing over the sand like liquid metal, striking before their victims could even draw a breath to scream. The first deaths were the most horrific. Strong men in the prime of life collapsing mid-step, their faces frozen in surprise as the venom coursed through their veins, turning their limbs rigid before they even hit the ground. Women gathering water crumbled beside their shattered jars, their fingers clawing at swollen throats as the poison closed their airways. Children who'd been playing the dust moments before now arrived in silent agony, their small bodies contorting as their nervous systems rebelled against them. Chaos erupted through the camp as people fled in every direction, only to find more serpents waiting wherever they turned. Some tried to fight back, swinging tent poles or cooking implements of the darting shapes, but for every serpent struck down, two more seemed to take its place. The air filled with a sound of terror, screams, prayers, the thud of bodies hitting the ground, and beneath it all, that terrible hissing, as if the desert itself were laughing at their suffering. Moses stood frozen for only a moment before instinct took over. He began moving toward the tabernacle, his staff held before him like a talisman, but the way was blocked by panicked Israelites running blindly in every direction. A woman crashed into him, her eyes wild with terror, her lips already turning blue from a bite on her neck. She grabbed at his robes, her fingers leaving dark smears of sweat and blood, before collapsing at his feet. All around him, the camp he led for so long was dying, and the weight of her accusations, "You brought us here to die," hum in the air like smoke. When he finally reached the tabernacle, his breath came in ragged gasps, his heart pounding not just from exertion, but from the terrible understanding dawning in his mind. This was no natural plague. The serpents were judgment made flesh, divine wrath given teeth and venom. He felt his knees before the entrance, his forehead pressing into the hot sand, and when he spoke, his voice was raw with grief and fury. "What would you have me do?" The answer came not in words, but in the sudden, perfect clarity of thought, an image forming in his mind as clearly as if it were already before him. A serpent of bronze, lifted high on a pole, its form mirroring the creatures even now slaughtering his people. The instructions were absurd in their simplicity. Make an image of their tormentor, set it up where all could see, and promise that whoever looked upon it would live. There was no time to question, no time to doubt. Moses called for Aaron and Hur, his voice cutting through the chaos with unexpected strength. The craftsmen came running, their faces pale with fear, but they set to work without hesitation when Moses described what was needed. A fire was kindled, bronze melted down, and as the screams continued to echo for the camp, the serpent took shape under Moses' guidance. Not a crude approximation, but perfect replica of the deadly creatures even now claiming lives. Every scale, every curve of its fanged mouth rendered with terrible accuracy. When it was finished, Moses himself lifted the bronze serpent onto a long pole, its weight negligible compared to the burden of leadership he had carried for so long. He planted the pole firmly in the center of the camp, where all could see, and raised his voice above the din. Look! The command echoed across the chaos. Look upon what has struck you and live. At first, no one listened. The dying continued to writhe, the healthy continued to flee, and the serpents continued their deadly work. But then, one by one, the men began to turn their faces toward the strange standard. A mother, cradling her limp child, was the first, her tear-filled eyes lifting to the gleaming bronze even as she prepared to mourn. As she looked, the child in her arms suddenly gasped. Color returned to pale cheeks, the terrible rigidity leaving small limbs. A shout went up, and others began to turn. The bitten, the mourning, the desperate, all lifting their eyes to the serpent on the pole. The effect was immediate and miraculous. Wherever a person looked upon the bronze serpent, the venom's hold was broken, swelling receded, paralysis lifted, and those who had been moments from death rose to their feet, weeping and praising God. The serpents themselves did not vanish. They slipped away into shadows as silently as they come, leaving behind their dead, and the terrible lesson etched into every survivor's heart. As night fell and the camp grew quiet, Moses stood alone before the bronze serpent, now gleaming faintly in the moonlight. The air was cooler now, carrying the scent of crushed herbs and the distant wailing of those mourning loved ones too far gone to be saved by the remedy. He reached out one callous hand, tracing the curve of the serpent's metal body, and understood with terrible clarity the message God had sent. Salvation and judgment were two sides of the same coin, and sometimes one had to gaze unflinchingly at the instrument of their suffering to find deliverance. The whispers at night were different. Not a complaint, but of awe and, perhaps for the first time in many years, of genuine repentance. The people moved quietly about their evening tasks, their eyes frequently darting to the center camp where the bronze serpent still stood, its hollow eyes seeming to watch them all. And Moses, sitting alone at the entrance of his tent, knew this would not be the last time they forgot, not the last time they rebelled, but perhaps now, when the whispers began again, they would remember the hiss of serpents and the terrible, merciful gaze of the God who had given them both the venom and the cure. Chapter 5, The Worn-Out Sandals, years 17 to 20. The unrelenting passage of time had worn grooves into the soles of his sandals as deep as the lines etched upon his withered face, each crease telling stories of endless miles traveled through valleys of shadow and across plains of scorching despair, where the very air seemed thick with the weight of unanswered prayers and the ground trembled with the aftershocks of dying dreams. These years, 17 through 20, stretched before him like an interminable wasteland where every morning's waking brought not renewal, but the crushing familiarity of struggle. With a man of God's provision, though never failing in his material sustenance, had long since lost any taste of wonder, becoming instead the bland daily reminder that survival in the wilderness requires the death of expectation, the surrender of all demands for flavor in favor of simple, unadorned nourishment. The sandals that had once carried him with such hopeful strides into this journey now barely clung to his blistered feet, their leather cracked like the parched earth beneath him. their straps frayed like the edges of his resolve. Yet somehow, miraculously, they held together, just as his fragile face somehow continued to bear the unbearable weight of each new day's march. This was a profound paradox of Deuteronomy 8 verse for made flesh in his experience. That divine faithfulness often manifests most powerfully not in prevention aware, but in a miraculous endurance through it. Not in protecting from the journey's damage, but in preserving despite it, allowing every hardship to strip away another layer of self-reliance until nothing remained but the raw, exposed truth of absolute dependence. The wilderness, he was learning, is God's great unraveling, where all the carefully woven threads of human strength and wisdom slowly come undone, so that the golden strand of divine sovereignty might shine forth unencumbered, where garments were thin not because God had forgotten to clothe his children, but because he desires to reveal what lies beneath the fabric of human pretension. Day after relentless day, the redoctor moved forward in his crucible of attrition, each step a small death, each mile a funeral for some cherished assumption about how God should act, each passing month stripping away another illusion until he stood spiritually naked before the Almighty, with nothing to offer but his brokenness and nothing to plead but God's own promises. The desert wind howled to the tattered remains of his cloak like a living thing, whispering secrets about the nature of true faith that can only be learned when all other supports have been removed, when every human prop has been kicked away, and the soul finds itself suspended over the abyss, held up by nothing but the invisible hand of the one who led him into this barren place. The blisters on his feet became altars of understanding, the hunger in his belly a sacred tutor, the perpetual thirst a relentless preacher declaring that man does not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds in the mouth of God, even when that word seems silent, even when the only audible sound is the mournful sigh of wind across the sands. In this school of suffering, the redoctor learned lessons that can never be taught in palaces of plenty or halls of comfort. That the God who gives and also withhold, that the God who speaks can also remain silent, that the God who delivers can also prolong the trial, and that all these manifestations are equally expressions of his perfect love. The wilderness makes no apology for its harsh curriculum, offers no reprieve from its demanding tutelage. But for those who endure its lessons comes a slow dawning realization that the desert is not punishment but preparation, not abandonment but the highest form of attention, where God strips his servant of everything they lean on so they will learn to lean on him alone. The sandals wore out but did not disintegrate. The garments grew thin but did not disappear. The body weakened but did not fail, and in these small miracles of continued existence, the redoctor found signs of greater miracles still, but the God who brought him into this wilderness was carefully measuring every trial, precisely calculating every deprivation, expertly monitoring every weakening of his natural strength, so that at exactly the right moment, the power of Christ might be made, perfect in his human frailty. The cracks in his sandal became sacred text, the fraying of his cloak a living parable, the daily diminishing of his physical resources a visible demonstration of the eternal truth that when we are weak, then we are strong, not because weakness itself is value, but because it makes room for divine strength to operate unhindered. These years of attrition became for the redoctor a slow-motion epiphany, a gradual awakening to the reality that the greatest danger in the wilderness is not dying there, but failing to be transformed by it. That the true tragedy would be to traverse the desert and emerge no different than when he entered. And so he embraced the wearing down, not with resignation but with holy anticipation, not with despair but with stubborn hope, knowing that each frayed thread in his garment was making room for the robe of righteousness. Each crack in his sandals was preparing his feet to stand firm on a rock that is higher than I. Each weakening of his natural strength was creating capacity for spiritual power beyond anything he had previously imagined. The wilderness was not his enemy but his midwife, assisting the birth of a new kind of faith. One that could walk by sight when the path was clear, but could also walk by faith when the way ahead was shrouded in mystery. One that could rejoice in abundance, but could also give thanks in want. one that could believe for miracles but could also endure when a miracle was simply strength to take one more step in worn-out sandals. This was a hard-won wisdom of years 17 through 20, that sometimes God's greatest gifts come wrapped in sandpaper, that his most profound work often happens in hidden places where no one applauds and no one sees, where the only witnesses are the vultures circling overhead, and the only encouragement is a quiet voice whispering, "This is the way, walk in it," even when the way leads through more wilderness, even when the sandals are nearly gone, even when the journey seems it will never end. For it is in these crucible years that pilgrims become prophets, that followers become leaders, that wounded healers are prepared to bind up the brokenhearted, not despite their scars, but because of them, not in spite of their wilderness, but precisely through what they learned there in the school of worn-out sandals and threadbare garments, where God preserves even as he prunes, where he sustains even as he strips away, where he prepares his servants in the hidden place, so that when their time comes, they will be ready, not just to survive the wilderness, but to lead others through it. Chapter 6. The Weeping of the Buried, years 21 to 24. The desert had become a vast catacomb, its shifting sands whispering secrets of judgment with every gust of wind that rattled the tent flaps at midnight. The redoctor lay awake in those hollow hours between moonset and dawn, listening to labored breathing of a dying generation, each ragged inhalation sounding like the rasp of a shovel against stony earth, each exhalation carrying the faintest echo of Korah's rebellion. These were the years when the very air tasted of mortality, when every sunrise revealed new faces missing from the morning count, when a pillar of cloud by day seemed to hover lower over the camp as if in mourning. The sand no longer merely recorded their journey. It was becoming their archive, their collective tombstone, swallowing not just bodies but an entire era of disbelief. The burials began quietly at first, an elder here, a murmurer there. But by the 22nd year, death walked openly through the camp like an uninvited priest performing some terrible consecration. The redoctor found himself developing a morbid expertise. He could now distinguish between the cough that would pass and the one that would end in a shallow grave. He recognized a particular glassiness in eyes that had begun seeing beyond the veil. He knew which tremors in a man's hands signaled mere exhaustion, and which marked the beginning of that final, irreversible decline. The earth seemed to grow hungrier with each passing season, its mouth opening wider to receive the faithless. They buried them without ceremony but with terrifying efficiency, their funeral rites reduced to the minimum, a winding cloth, a psalm half whispered, the thud of earth on a body that had already begun its return to dust before the last shovelful fell. What haunted the redoctor most wasn't the dying but the manner of it. This was expiration without spectacle, judgment stripped of all theater. No fire from heaven, no gaping earth, just a slow unraveling of the mortal coil as if God had simply withdrawn his sustaining hand and let nature take its course with mathematical precision. The strong faltered first, men who had carried the tabernacle's heaviest beams now struggling to lift the waterskin, women who had danced at the Red Sea crossing barely able to raise their hands to cover their coughs. The redoctor kept a mental ledger of their departures. Ezra the doubter gone by the first winter, Miriam who always complained about the manna taken by a fever in the 22nd summer, Jachin who had led the golden calf revelry buried in an unmarked grave during the rains of the 23rd year. Each death carved another silence into the fabric of the camp, until the nights grew so quiet he could hear the scorpions moving beneath the rocks. The children adapted with that terrible resilience of the young. They played their games between the graves, their laughter now tinged with understanding beyond their years. The redoctor would watch them sometimes, these inheritors of the promise, as they mimicked the burial rituals with sticks for shovels and sand for bodies. They had developed their own folklore about the sleeping ones, whispering theories about why Abba didn't wake up or where Ima had really gone. Their questions had changed too, no longer when we get there. But will I be buried like Uncle Nashin? The redoctor answered as honestly as he dared, walking that knife's edge between truth and terror. between preparing them and paralyzing them. By the 24th year, the camp's geography had transformed entirely. What had once been a sprawling, chaotic settlement had contracted into tight clusters around the tabernacle, as if huddling close to holiness might provide some protection. The empty spaces between tents told their own story. Here a cooking pit gone cold, there a set of footprints that ended abruptly and weren't continued. The redoctor found himself navigating by absence more than presence, remembering who used to occupy what space rather than who currently did. Even Amanda seemed to fall differently now, still faithful in his arrival, but landing in smaller drifts that required less gathering. The arithmetic of their dwindling was everywhere if one knew how to look. In his darkest moments, the redoctor wondered if this was what redemption looked like. Not a dramatic rescue, but this slow winnowing, this painful separating of wheat from chaff. He dreamed in bones now, visions of skeletons rising from the sand to accuse or absolve him. He could never tell which. The line between justice and mercy blurred in the desert heat until he could no longer distinguish between God's severity and his compassion. Perhaps they were the same thing viewed from different angles. Perhaps this burial ground was actually a birthing room. Perhaps every grave was simultaneously a monument to unbelief and a foundation stone for faith. The tabernacle services grew more poignant as the congregation shrank. When the silver trumpets sounded now, their calls seemed to hang in the air longer, as if passing to the veil between living and dead. The redoctor found himself listening for echoes, some response from all those buried just beyond the camp's borders. But the only answer was a wind, that eternal breath moving across the wilderness, carrying the topsoil of their grief to parts unknown. He took to walk in the perimeter at twilight, tracing the invisible boundary between camp and cemetery, between the living and those who had ceased their wandering. Sometimes he would stop and press his palm against the earth, feeling for some vibration, some sign that what was sown in weakness would be raised in power. But the ground kept its secrets. By the end of the 24th year, something unexpected began happening. The constant attrition had birthed a strange new solidarity among the survivors. They moved differently now, with more purpose, with fewer complaints. The children had grown lean and watchful, their eyes holding none of the Egypt nostalgia that had poisoned their parents. The redoctor noticed at first in their songs, the melodies hadn't changed, but something in the singing had. Less longing, more anticipation. Less looking back, more straining forward. Even the manna tasted different somehow, or maybe it was their taste buds that had changed. Their palates finally acclimated to heaven's diet. On the last night of the 24th year, the redoctor climbed a small rise overlooking the camp. From this vantage point, he could see both the living and the dead, the flickering lights of the remaining tents and beyond them, the subtle undulations in the earth marking where thousands lay in their sandy cradles. The wind carried the scent of myrrh from someone's evening sacrifice. Somewhere a child laughed. The pillar of fire began its nightly vigil over the tabernacle, and in that moment, the redoctor understood the terrible, beautiful mathematics of the wilderness. That 40 years was both a sentence and a gift, that burial was a form of preservation, that sometimes life comes through death, and that the weeping of the buried waters the seeds of promise in ways only God fully comprehends. He turned his face toward Canaan, though he couldn't see it yet, and for the first time in years his eyes were dry. Chapter 7, The Clouds That Do Not Rain. Years 25-28. The heavens have become a theater of cruel illusions, a vast amphitheater where each dawn paints the same torturous spectacle. Great billowing clouds, dark and swollen with promise, gathering like an invading army on the horizon, their underbellies bruised purple with the weight of unshed rain. They march across the sky with slow, taunting precision, casting fleeting shadows over camp that tease a cracked earth before dissipating into nothingness by midday, leaving behind a searing blue void that seemed to mock their desperation. The redoctor stood each morning in the pre-dawn chill, his breath shallow to conserve moisture, watching as the people emerge in their tents like withered plants seeking sunlight, their eyes scanning the sky with mixture of hope and resignation, their lips split and bleeding, moved in silent prayers that evaporated fast in the morning dew, their tongues swollen and heavy in their mouths, their voices reduced to rasping whispers. The children, those born under this merciless sky, no longer asked when the rain would come. Instead, they licked the stones at dawn, their small tongues darting out like lizards, searching for the faintest trace of condensation. Their games now revolving around imaginary rivers drawn in the dust with sticks they had chewed to splinters. The livestock, once sturdy and plentiful, had dwindled to a skeletal remnant, their ribs protruding like the staves of broken barrels, their hides stretched tight over protruding bones. The goats, their udders long since dry, stood listless in the scant-shaded tents, their eyes dull with a resignation that mirrored the people's. The few remaining sheep had ceased to bleat, conserving their energy, their wool matted with dust and brittle as straw. Even the birds had abandoned them, their migratory paths altered to avoid this cursed stretch of wilderness, leaving the morning silent but for the dry rasp of wind over stone. The redoctor had taken to marking the days by the deepening hollows in the children's cheeks, by the way their collarbones grew sharper beneath their sun-darkened skin, by the way their laughter had faded into a brittle, breathless thing, as if even joy required more water than they could spare. The nights were no kinder. The temperature plummeted as soon as the sun dipped below the horizon, the heat of the day leaching away into the void of the desert night, leaving them shivering in their thin robes, their breath fogging the air though no moisture touched their lips. The redoctor would lie awake, listening to the camp's quiet suffering, the soft, broken whimpers of children dreaming of water, the muffled coughs of elders whose lungs had grown dry as tinder, the occasional gasp of someone waking in terror, their throat clenched tight with thirst. He had begun to see visions in the darkness, phantom pools shimmering just beyond the edge of the camp, mirages that persisted even when he closed his eyes, taunting him with what he could not have. Some nights, he pressed his ear to the ground, straining to hear the distant murmur of underground streams, the memory of rivers long vanished, as if the earth itself mourned their absence. The manna still came, as regular as the sunrise, but had changed. No longer the soft, honey-sweet flakes of the early years. It had grown coarse, gritty, its taste bland and metallic, as if even its divine provision had been worn down by the relentless aridity. The people ate it without relish, forcing it down with mouths so dry it stuck to their tongues like paste. The redoctor watched as they moved through the motions of survival, their bodies growing gaunt, their movements sluggish, their spirits frayed like the edges of their sun-bleached garments. They had stopped complaining. There were no more muttered grievances about Egypt, no more nostalgic longing for the leeks and onions of their former lives. The drought had burned even that from them, leaving behind only the raw, unspoken question, how much longer? And then, in the third year of the drought, the miracles began. Small, subtle, easily missed if one wasn't looking. The redoctor noticed it first in the way the morning dew, though still pitifully scant, seemed to cling just a little longer to manna, as if heaven itself were trying to ease their suffering. Then came the singing stones, great slabs of basalt in the wadis that, when struck at just the right angle with copper blade, would emit a deep, resonant tone that seemed to pull moisture from the air itself. Tiny droplets would bead on the stone surface, trembling like tears before sliding down into waiting bowls. The children, ever adaptable, had taken to this new ritual with a solemn reverence, their small hands carefully tapping the stones in sequences they claimed were taught to them in dreams. The redoctor did not dismiss their claims. In this place, where the line between the divine and the desperate had blurred, who was to say what was revelation and what was hallucination? The livestock, too, began to change. The goats grew elongated ears, their veins standing out in stark relief beneath thin skin. radiating heat like living radiators. The few remaining donkeys produced urine so concentrated it could etch marks in the clay, their bodies hoarding every precious drop of moisture. Even the dogs, those loyal, half-wild creatures that followed them from Egypt, developed a strange new behavior, digging shallow pits in the cool earth beneath the tents and pressing their bellies into the damp soil, their tongues licking at the stones as if they too could taste the promise of water. And then one evening, as the sun bled out across the horizon in streaks of orange and violet, the Doctor saw it, a single cloud, no larger than a man's hand, rising from the west. It moved against the wind, drifting inexorably toward the camp, its edges glowing with the last light of day. He stood, his breath caught in his throat, watching as it grew, swelling with unnatural speed, its underbelly darkening. The camp fell silent behind him, the people emerging from their tents, their eyes fixed on the sky. No one spoke, no one dared. The first drop struck his forehead like a benediction. Then the sky broke open. Rain fell in sheets and torrents, in great, gasping waves that drowned the dust and filled the wadis in moments. The people stood frozen, their faces turned upward, their mouths open as if they could drink the entire sky. The children laughed, their voices ringing out clear and bright for the first time in years, their arms outstretched as if to embrace the deluge. The Doctor felt the water running down his face, mingling with tears he hadn't known he could still produce. And in that moment he understood. The drought had not been punishment. It had been preparation for this, for the flood, for the promise that after the long silence, the heavens would speak again. And when they did, it would be in a language of abundance. Chapter 8. The Children Who Grew, years 29 to 32. The desert wind carried the sound of their laughter like a new kind of scripture, weaving through the tents and over the dunes of the cadence of a psalm never written, yet older than any scroll. These were the wild-born children, conceived under a sky that had known no ceiling but stars, whose first steps had fallen not on palace tiles but on sun-warmed sand, who moved through the wilderness not as prisoners wandering in judgment, but as princes in training. Pharaoh prophets with dust-stained garments and eyes full of fire, their limbs sun-bronzed and strong, swung from acacia branches with effortless grace. Their feet, callous like leather, skipped across burning stones that would have blistered the softened souls of their parents, born in bondage and bred for bricks. There was something startling in the way they moved, like creatures designed not for mere survival, but for sovereignty. And their eyes, oh, their eyes, did not carry the shadowed shame of Egypt, but instead gazed at the horizon with the terrifying certainty of those who had never bowed their necks to a whip, who had never learned to fear their own voices, who bore in their very marrow the unshakable conviction that the desert was not a tomb but a forge. The Doctor, once a man of measures and manuals, now watched with both a scholar's fascination and a father's trembling awe. He witnessed in these children not just adaptation but transformation. What the elders called scarcity, they interpreted as mystery waiting to be unlocked. What others mourned as loss, they reimagined as opportunity. They were not just enduring the wilderness, they were reinventing it. They discovered hidden sweetness in bitter melons by some arcane ritual of roasting and prayer, coaxed drinkable sap from bark their parents deemed useless, and wove cloaks from desert cotton that repelled sand and breathed like living skin. From dry gourds and lizard hides, they crafted flutes and drums and stringed instruments that sang to the stars, strange psalms born of silence and wind and the rhythm of their own beating hearts. Each invention was a quiet rebellion against the poverty of imagination, a subtle but seismic break from the nostalgia that held the elders in invisible chains. They could track falcons by the shimmer in the sky and predict rain from the scent of creosote before the sun had even risen. They moved with the silence of shadows and precision of prophets, charting constellations their parents had never noticed, following internal maps etched not in ink but in instinct. Their dreams were not haunted by pyramids and meat pots, but alight with visions of cities they'd never seen, temples they'd never entered, orchards they'd never touched. Yet they believed in them with faith deeper than memory, as if they remembered a future that hadn't happened yet, and their bodies taller, stronger, straighter, their lungs shaped by air untainted by brick dust, their teeth gleaming with the health of unprocessed manna and pure desert water, their fingers equally skilled at carving olive wood or sketching Hebrew letters into sand. Their voices carried a peculiar resonance of wilderness-born speech, raw, unfiltered, echoing strangely between cliffs as if the desert itself were learning to praise through them. The girls moved with a fearless grace that unsettled the old men who still expected submission from the soft-voiced. They climbed rocks not to hide, but to tie signal flags of games that mimic conquest. They debated Torah with their brothers, their eyes sharp with questions, their words quick as lightning, their braids flying like war banners in the wind. The boys would become uncanny shepherds and desert whisperers, coaxing milk from reluctant goats, taming wild foxes, even silencing snakes with low, melodic hums, tunes no adult recognized, but which seemed to have always belonged to the sand. And the redoctor wrote and wrote and wrote, his scrolls now filled with stories that defied doctrine. He documented their games that mirror prophecy, stick swords topping imagined Canaanite strongholds, sand maps of the promised land growing more detailed each month though no eye had yet seen it, their lullabies slowly shifting from laments to battle hymns to love songs for a homeland they'd never touched. Their play was not innocent. It was intuitive, patterned after some divine blueprint buried deep within. At night, around fire pits cleverly shielded from wind, another of their innovations, they questioned everything. Why circumcision if the heart was what mattered? Why did some laws demand blood and others only grain? Did angels eat manna? Why did God choose a desert as a classroom? Their questions bright and searing, sliced through centuries of inherited tradition, and the redoctor, old enough to remember slavery, answered as honestly as he dared, knowing that these were not just curious children, but polished arrows and divine quiver, aimed at futures even Moses had not imagined. But it was their dreams that troubled and illuminated him most. The older generation dreamed only of what they had lost. Egyptian garlic leeks and cucumbers, the illusion of safety in slavery. But these children dreamed of things they had no memory of. White stone cities they'd never built, olive groves they'd never planted, temple rituals no living priest had ever performed. They dreamed in blueprints. Their minds were tuned to a frequency of promise their parents couldn't hear. And slowly, the redoctor realized they were not just surviving the wilderness, they were becoming it. Their minds were being rewired by drought into networks of revelation. Their spirits were being shaped not by fear, but by fire. They were no longer Egyptian, not yet Canaanite. They were something entirely new under the sun. By the 32nd year, the evidence was everywhere. The camp no longer looked like a temporary encampment of wanderers. It moved with the organic precision of a living organism. The tents were arranged in concentric circles for defense and communication. Cooking fires vented smoke underground to avoid detection. Even Amanda was prepared with new spices and drying techniques that coaxed flavor where the elders had only tasted ash. And one morning, the redoctor looked around and realized the children were no longer children. The boys bore beard thick as tamarisk groves. The girls walked with the poise of queens untrained in shame. Their voices in council were listened to with reverence. Their laughter rang louder than command. And when they prayed, the very air responded, shivering with the weight of heaven's nearness. The day the first wilderness-born child was delivered by wilderness-born hands. A silent girl with onyx eyes who did not cry, but instead studied her mother with calm comprehension. The redoctor climbed a ridge and looked down to camp glowing with life where only death had once seemed to reign. And in that moment, Clarity struck him like Sinai's fire. These were not merely children of ex-slaves. They were a new species. Their DNA had been remade by sand and scarcity, their souls burnished by silence and light. They carried no nostalgia for Pharaoh, no memory of chains. They were not the fruit of captivity, but the harvest of a long obedience. You could take the people out of Egypt in a moment, but to take Egypt out of people, that took time, drought, mystery, fire, 40 years of divine reprogramming. These children, these terrifyingly luminous, impossibly fearless, thunder-souled children, were to their parents what butterflies eye caterpillars, what wheat is to the seed, what the promised land is to the wilderness, both its fulfillment and its ending, as the sun sank low and gilded their faces with liquid gold. The redoctor at last understood the deepest mystery of their journey. Moses could not enter the land, not as punishment, but because even he carried too much of Egypt in his bones. This inheritance was not for the wise or the wounded. It belonged to the ones who had never been taught to be afraid. Chapter 9, The Smell of Canaan, years 33 to 36. They smelled it before they saw it, and that was the strangest miracle of all. Not the scent itself, which came in whispers and waves like some ancient perfume spilled into the air, but the way every head turned at once, every nostril flared, every conversation fell silent as an invisible chorus had swept through the camp, singing in a language only the body could understand. This is a scent of promise. It began in the early hours just before dawn, when the desert winds shifted and carried with them something altogether foreign. Moisture, yes, but richer than dew, deeper than fog, a scent that spoke of shaded groves and ripening figs, a myrrh blooming on far hillsides and olive trees weeping their first oil onto fertile ground. It was not merely an aroma, but a memory stirred in the marrow, a ghost of gardens they had never seen and harvests only told in stories around the fire. The redoctor was the first to speak aloud, though the father bloomed wordless in the hearts of every wilderness-born child. Canaan, he whispered, voice cracked and reverent, and in that instant the entire camp seemed to breathe differently, as if lungs that learned only survival were now remembering desire. Children woke before the call, standing barefoot outside their tents, blinking toward the horizon as if trying to decipher a vision too vast rise alone. Mothers stopped mid-motion in their chores, tasting the air with their tongues like prophets sampling prophecy. Even the animals reacted. Goats bleated with renewed vigor, their noses twitching toward the north. Birds returned in unfamiliar flocks, wings slicing the sky in patterns that no one recognized but all believed were omens. The scent was not consistent. It vanished at midday like a dream fleeing light, but returned each evening stronger than before, pulling hearts forward like a hook sunk deep in the soul. Fires burned longer, eyes stared farther, voices spoke softer. The redoctor began to write again, his quill dancing fast and his hand could follow, capturing not just facts but sensations, recording the dreams that now came nightly to the wilderness-born. Dreams of vineyards and rain-kissed wheat, of homes with doors that did not flap in the wind but stood firm in stone, of laughter echoing off walls painted in ochre and blue. And the elders who had survived more years than they could count began to fall silent around the fires, their authority cracking like old leather under the weight of the children's certainty. It was a youth who now spoke with the fire of truth, their words sharp of conviction, their hands drawing plans in the dust that looked like blueprints of cities no one had built. They trained differently, too, less for wandering and more for arrival. Their bodies, already lean from years of discipline, now gained precision, muscles coiled with intent, eyes sharpened with focus. Feet learned the rhythm of permanence. Girls who had once danced for wind gods now moved as priestesses preparing for temple rites. Boys with thrown stones at imaginary foes now carved arrows tipped with hope and strategy. They built altars not of desperation but of anticipation, shaping stones into symbols that spoke of arrival, of covenant, of home. Each evening became a rehearsal for a future not yet visible but undeniably close. Then came the day when the scouts returned, those silent-footed few sent ahead, to see if hope had a shape. They came back weeping, not from fear, not from despair, but from awe. They carried no spoils, no proof, only the dirt under their nails and the look in their eyes that said everything. It's real. The mountains they described were crowned in mist, the rivers wide and singing with silver fish. The valleys bloomed with wildflowers in colors a wilderness had never known. They spoke of trees so tall they whispered to the heavens, of fields that sighed when the wind passed over them at a lover's touch. But what undid the camp entirely, what caused even a redoctor to fall to his knees, was what one of them carried, a branch, thick with clusters of grapes, so heavy it took 2 men to bear it. The fruit looked unnatural in its abundance, swollen with purple promise, weeping juice in the heat. The children surrounded it in reverent silence, their hands hesitant to touch, as if afraid it might vanish. The scent, now stronger than ever, poured from the branch and into their bones. That night no one slept. The camp shimmered with the light of torches, of whispered prayers, of quiet songs carried on wind that now blew not from the wilderness but from the west. The redoctor sat by the fruit until dawn, watching dew gather on its skin like tears of land finally welcoming its children home. Around him, elders murmured prayers they had forgotten, invoking names long buried in their throats. Children hummed melodies that seemed born of the soil itself, notes too old for their young lips, yet perfectly formed. And as the sun rose, casting gold over the desert that had never looked so temporary, he whispered again, with more certainty than ever, Canaan. Yet the days that followed were not without fear, for with knowledge of the promise came the weight of choice. No longer were they aimless wanderers clinging to men and memory. They were now heirs of something vast and real. The laws written on stone began to burn brighter in their minds, not as burdens but as blueprints. Questions rose like incense from every tent. How would they divide the land? Who would guard the borders? Could their souls withstand prosperity as they had endured poverty? Even the children felt it, the gravity of inheritance. Their games changed. They played less and planned more. Sandcastles became fortresses, and songs became anthems. And each evening, the scent returned, as if reminding them gently, prepare, prepare, prepare. The redoctor noted that the wilderness itself seemed to be cooperating now. Plants sprouted in unexpected places. Streams emerged from long dead beds. Even the wind seemed to cool them with mercy instead of scourge. It was as if the desert, long their adversary, had become their tutor, its final lesson being release. One dusk, as if a horizon blazed with amber fire and the children practiced battle drills with wooden spears, the redoctor stood atop a rise and watched the entire camp move with precision and purpose. He did not see a camp of former slaves or weary sojourners. He saw a nation in embryo, sacred and unstoppable. His heart swelled until it ached, for he understood now that the wilderness had not been a detour. It had been the womb, and Canaan was not the end of their story, but its true beginning. Chapter 10. The Final Step. Years 37 to 40. The air atop Mount Nebo hung thick with the weight of unspoken goodbyes, a palpable silence that seemed to stretch across the Jordan Valley and into the very fabric of time itself, as Moses, his face still radiant with the afterglow of divine intimacy, his staff now more an extension of his arm and a mere tool, stood gazing at the promised land spread out before him like a banquet he would never taste. His eyes traced the contours of hills he would never climb and rivers he would never cross, his heart swelling with a bittersweet ache that transcended mere disappointment. For this was a culmination of a journey that had begun 80 years prior when he fled Egypt a murderer and returned a deliverer. 40 years since he'd struck the rock in frustration and now stood on this mountain in surrender, his life measured not in seasons but in miracles, not in years but in Yahweh's faithfulness. Around him, the wind carried no sound but seemed full of presence, as if nature itself bowed in reverence to the final breath of a prophet. The redoctor watched from a respectful distance, every fiber as being alert to the sacredness of this hour. He could feel it, something eternal shifting. Moses' chest rose and fell with labor breath, each inhalation a testament to endurance, each exhalation a release of earthly attachment. The very atmosphere was charged with that electric holiness that precedes epical transitions, as the creation itself held its breath waiting for the transfer of authority from the one who could part seas, but not his own stubborn will, to the young warrior Joshua, whose brow already bore the imprint of coming conquests. Down below, the Israelite camp was eerily quiet, the people having felt the shift in the air like animals sensing a coming storm. These wilderness-hardened survivors, who had once been children gathering manna, were now themselves parents and grandparents, bearing on their skin the mark of son and survival, and in their eyes a paradox of longing and readiness. They sensed without being told that the mantle was shifting, that the age of miraculous bread from heaven was giving way to the age of fighting for vineyards they hadn't planted, of forging their inheritance through sweat and sword. Moses, sensing their collective trembling, turned one last time to face them, his voice now carrying not the hesitant stammer of an unsure shepherd, but the thunderous clarity of one who had spoken with the I Am. He delivered blessings tribe by tribe, blessings so precise and layered they cut through generations like a sword through Canaanite armor. These were no ordinary words. They were a final act of spiritual architecture, laying down foundations that would outlast tents and temples. As he spoke, it seemed the sky grew clearer, the horizon sharper, as if even the elements awaited his final utterance. And then he climbed unaided to the summit where no more like a follow, and the redoctor, with hands trembling, wrote what he could not see. The way Moses' weathered face must have broken into astonished joy as the hands that carved commandments on stone were finally grasped by the one who had authored them, the man who couldn't enter earthly Canaan, stepping instead into the unfiltered presence of the God who had been his true promised land all along. And below, the Israelite camp erupted in a mourning so visceral, it shook the wilderness birds from their nests. 30 days of unrelenting wails, of garments torn and ashes poured, of voices lifted in sorrow that stripped grief bare of all decorum. For how does one mourn a man who had been the very embodiment of divine mediation? Yet even in their sorrow, the redoctor noted the subtle shifting, the way Joshua's shoulders straightened when he thought no one was looking, the way the younger generation began oiling their weapons with new intensity, the way the manna still appeared each morning as if to whisper that though the messenger was gone, the promise giver remained. And when at last the morning period ended, the pillar of cloud began moving eastward toward Jordan's banks. The people followed not with a dragging feet of slaves, but with a determined stride of those who finally understood this terrifying truth, that the same God who buried Moses in an unmarked grave would fight for them as they crossed into battles they've been prepared for, but didn't yet know how to win. The redoctor walked the perimeter of the camp daily, taking notes on everything, the prayers murmured in family tents, the sharpening of swords and minds alike, the songs that had shifted from laments to anthems, He watched priests rehearse carrying the ark, their hands trembling not from fear, but from the awe of proximity to the holy. Children were quieter now, their play more focused, more symbolic. Stick swords reenacted future battles, not past ones. Girls carved sigils into the dust with deliberate intent. The redoctor wrote page after page, not just what he saw, but of what he knew. This was not the end of the journey, but the birth of a people. He saw old men laying their hands on younger shoulders, transferring wisdom with a glance. He saw mothers folding tents with care, but without nostalgia. The entire camp was becoming a body, a living organism of covenant and calling. Joshua no longer looked to the mountain for guidance. He looked to the people. His voice deepened. His orders gained precision. He was no longer the aide of prophet, but the appointed of Yahweh, bearing the weight of inheritance and the fire of divine appointment. Every morning, before the first goat bleated, Joshua walked the edge of the Jordan and stood still, eyes fixed on the water, waiting, not for a sign, but for the right moment. He knew now what Moses had always known, that timing belonged to God, not men. As they prepared to cross, the air itself seemed to vibrate with sacred tension. Flocks of birds shifting direction mid-flight, the Jordan's water swelling slightly as it preparing to part once again, and the youngest children quiet in their play as if intuitively sensing the momentousness of what was to come. The final night in the wilderness, fires burned lower and closer, and songs were sung that hadn't been heard in decades. Songs about Egypt, about plagues, about the first Passover, but also new songs, improvised on the stars, full of hope and holy defiance. The people did not sleep much that night. Eyes blinked open at the smallest sound. Some wept, others sat in silence. The land beyond a river was both promise and provocation. The morning dawned with a strange clarity. Mist hovered over the Jordan like a veil, waiting to be lifted. The priests, bearing the ark, walked first. Feet met water, and the redoctor, from a distant hill, held his breath as the river obeyed once more. Water parted not just because of faith, but because time had reached its fullness. Behind the priest came the people, and behind him the redoctor, his scrolls fluttering, his heart breaking and soaring in the same beat. For this final step was not Moses' death, but Israel's decision to live as free people in a land they did not earn but had been given. And that perhaps was the holiest miracle of all. In that crossing, a generation became a nation, a promise became a place, and the wilderness finally loosened its grip. The journey was never just about getting out of Egypt. It was about becoming something the world had never seen, a people shaped by fire, sustained by glory, and unleashed by faith. Reflection for closing. And now, as the last flickers of firelight fade into quiet hum of wind over the still sands, and as the voices of the camp settle into long, deep breaths, we pause to think. We pause to reflect, not to rush, not to analyze, not to debate, but simply let the weight of these 40 years settle, like fine dust on a stone, like morning dew on a tent flap, like the memories that cling without permission to the corners of the soul. For what really is a journey if not a slow unfolding of time, marked not by distance traveled, but by who we become in the waiting. 40 years is a long time, and in that time there were steps, many steps. Steps that led nowhere, steps that retraced old paths, steps that stumbled in circles, steps that dragged with weariness, steps that danced for joy. And yet, all those steps mattered. Each grain of sand, each day of silence, each tear, each sunrise meant something. Even the steps that seemed to lead only deeper into the wilderness were, in some mysterious way, carrying them closer to home. And perhaps that's a lesson we often miss when we rush toward conclusions or crave immediate meaning, that even waiting, even wandering, is holy, that even when the land ahead is not yet ours to step into, the land beneath our feet is sacred because God walks with us there. And sometimes we don't realize the divine nearness until we look back and see the footprints alongside our own. Moses never entered the promised land, but he walked to the promised one. And isn't that, in the end, the deeper fulfillment? To find not just a place to settle, but a presence to rest in, to discover, perhaps slowly and not without struggle, that the real promise is not a plot of land, but the unyielding presence of faithful God, the same God who waited with them in the desert, who fed them when they were ungrateful, who forgave them when they were rebellious, who gave water when they complained, and who, when the time was right, opened the river just as he had once opened the sea. And so, as we lie down to sleep, we might also ask ourselves, where are we in the journey? Are we still in Egypt, longing for escape? Are we in the middle of a wilderness, confused by the delay? Are we staring at the Jordan, afraid to step in? Or are we, perhaps, simply learning to listen to the wind, to the stillness, to the small voice that never shouts but always speaks? There is something sacred in slowness, in repetition, in the dailiness of manna and morning, in the rising and falling of tents, in the tying and reading of sandals, in the circling of cloud and the flicker of fire, in the counting of stars and the retelling of old stories around smoky flames. And maybe, just maybe, God hides himself in these small, quiet things so that we might learn not to fear the silence, but to find a minute. For we, too, wander. We, too, carry burdens. We, too, walk forward without knowing the full map. And just like them, we are called to trust, not because the path is clear, but because the one who guides us is. The same voice that spoke from the bush still speaks in stillness. The same hand that split the sea still holds back the chaos. The same breath that filled the tabernacle still whispers in the quiet of night. But deeper still, there's a truth often missed. The wilderness is not a punishment. It is a classroom, a crucible, a sacred pause between what we were and what we are becoming. It is where the ego dies and the soul wakes up. It is where we stop asking what's next and begin asking, who am I when there's nothing to chase but God himself? The desert strips us of illusions. It shows us our hunger, our impatience, our idols, but it also shows us grace in surprising places. In a rock that gushes water, in a pillar of fire that warms the night, in the rhythm of divine provision that does not cease, in the quiet spaces where God speaks not with thunder, but with presence, not in the blaze, but in the whisper, not in arrival, but in accompaniment. Moses died on the edge of fulfillment, but not on the edge of purpose. His story teaches us that obedience is not measured by outcomes, but by faithfulness. That sometimes the most important role we play is not to finish the race, but to carry the baton far enough for others to finish, to trust that the unseen legacy of our prayers, our perseverance, and our presence will ripple into generations beyond our sight. So now, as your eyes begin to close, as your breathing deepens, as the night grows quieter still, remember, the journey may be long, but you are not alone. The desert may stretch far, but you are guided. The promises may take time, but they are sure. The final step is not always forward. It is often inward, into trust, into peace, into rest. So sleep now, not as one who is lost, but as one who is led. Sleep as one who walks with a God who neither slumbers nor sleeps. Sleep is one who has walked long and who will wake tomorrow with new strength, not to conquer the land in one day, but to take the next small, sacred step. Good night, sojourner spirit. Good night, pilgrim of promise. The desert winds are quiet now. The stars keep watch, and the journey continues in the morning.